Hello, Internet. This is Olin from What I'm Listening To. Happy Halloween. It is that time again to try to summon Ghost Olin to bring you more spooky and creepy music for this holiday. And because I'm in a new place from last year's recording, I had to set up a new set for him. We have the tripod there. We got a nice little seat for him. We have the microphone. We have Audacity ready to roll. So let's get going here. So let's get the audio recording. Yep, it's recording. And then we need to get the frame set up here. Make sure the microphone's out. Oh, things are getting difficult. Come on, get in there. I need to get a new tripod. Oh my gosh. Sorry guys, this is annoying. Get in there. There we go. Alright, cool. So, zoom in on that. Make sure that they would be in frame here. Perfect. Perfect. Okay, I'm gonna go leave, and hopefully in an hour I'll come back and I'll have some footage to edit. So anyways, then I was saying, it's Halloween, bitch, I'm spooky. Would you look at that? I guess, we're doing another vlog here. Alright, let's do this.
Don't scream, yeah, it's only Halloween. Don't scream, it's only Halloween.
Hello, Internets! This is Ghost Olin here from What I'm Listening To. It is once again Halloween, and I have returned from beyond the grave to give you more spooky music perfect for this holiday, which, let's be honest, it's probably just more metal and dark ambient music. In previous episodes, it seems I've only talked about 5 or 6 albums at a time, but this episode, I have a lot of stuff to bring you here, and I'm really excited to talk about it, so let's just jump right into it. And the first album I have for you today, I have Cradle of Filth's Midian. This is Cradle of Filth's 4th release, and it's the 2nd album by the band that I'd ever listened to. The first being Numenventimine, which I talked about in one of my other Halloween vlogs. Cradle of Filth is also one of the early bands responsible for getting me into the extreme metal genre, as well as helping me get accustomed to metal music with shrieking vocals and death growls. Compared to the sound of Numenventimine, which is a later release, this album is a little more rougher around the edges sounding, but definitely much more theatrical. The highlight track, which is my favorite song on the album, is Her Ghost in the Fog. On that song, the band successfully recreated that feeling of being in a horror movie set in a foggy environment. There's demonic voices, there's an operatic woman singing in the distance. It's really spooky sounding. But the rest of the album is just as good. Again, I like the rougher around the edges sound. The theatrics can be a little corny at times, but for the most part, this is a perfect album to listen to during Halloween. So, if you've never listened to this album, it's definitely worth checking out, along with Numenventimine. Those 2 albums are fantastic. The next album I have for you today, I have Lamb of God's Wrath. This is one of the band's later releases, and compared to some of their older stuff, it's a bit of a stylistic change. The band stated that they were going for a more cleaner sound sonically compared to their rougher sound that they did in the past. But for me, this was actually the first Lamb of God record I'd ever really listened to. It's the one that got me into the band in the first place. And I could have picked any of their albums to show off on this video, but I picked this album specifically for the song Reclamation. At the time I heard the song, I thought it was one of the darkest and menacing sounding metal songs I'd ever listened to. And what's more is it's much slower compared to some of their other songs. It's set in waltz time, which is something I'd never heard them do before. But I think that's part of what contributed to its darker sound. It kind of had this like creepy sort of quality to it. But overall, the rest of the album is really good too. There's some groovy stuff, there's some thrash metal stuff. It's just a fantastic listen. So definitely recommend checking this album out specifically for Reclamation. That's a perfect song for the holiday. Check it out. The next album I have for you today, I have The United States of Horror by Horror. This is a band that blends together hardcore punk and hip-hop, something that bands were doing way back in the late 90s and early 2000s, but in the 2010s, not so much. But I have a bit of a soft spot for that sound because I grew up listening to a lot of nu metal, and my first introduction to a lot of hip-hop music was it being blended together with rock. It can sound pretty lame at times, but you know what? It's a guilty pleasure of mine. But it's also not a record about being angry for the sake of being angry. There are some darker elements on this album, hence why it's in this video. The song Street Power samples the iconic Halloween theme. The interlude When Death Calls sounds like a bunch of demons being summoned from hell. And various other songs on the album cover themes of glorifying death, murder, and the darker side of the United States. It's overall a really cool record, and I honestly look forward to seeing what else these guys might make in the future. And I hope they continue making horrorcore music because that is another subgenre of hip-hop that we don't really see that often, and it's great when you hear it. Next album I have for you today, I have Walking with Strangers by The Birthday Massacre. This album is probably the first goth record I'd ever heard. At the time I first heard this album, I was really into synth-pop bands like the Shiny Toy Guns and Metric. And The Birthday Massacre sounds pretty similar to them too, but just with a more darker atmosphere. But the aspect that really blew my mind about this band was they were fusing dark synth-pop with hard rock. So the songs were incredibly melodic and could be dancey, but it was also just so heavy. I hadn't heard anything like it before, and I was hooked. And after hearing a couple tracks from this album, I bought it almost immediately. And I go back to it from time to time, like now, on Halloween. It's not the creepiest and most disturbing sounding music that I've shown off so far, but as far as darkness goes, it's perfect for Halloween. So if you have not checked this album out, I highly recommend it. It is so very good. Staying on the topic of goth music, the next album I have for you today, I have Only Theaters of Pain by Christian Death. This album is legendary in the world of goth rock. It's considered actually the first American goth record to be released. It's also a massive influence on the death rock genre, a genre that takes elements of horror and gothic theatrics and blends it together. But compared to The Birthday Massacre, who came much later in time, Christian Death is much more abrasive and rougher sounding. But despite the rougher sound, the songs are still fairly melodic. My favorite song off this album is Romeo's Distress, which has this crazy guitar freak-out moment during the chorus that sounds like the climactic point of a horror movie. Not to mention the vocals on not just that song, but the rest of the album are whiny and eerie and just kind of disturbing. Some folks have said they're a little bit annoying, but I personally find it just disturbing enough to love it. But yeah, this album is classic. It is so incredibly good. If you have not checked it out, you should do yourself a favor, give it a listen, and make it your sort of gateway into goth music, because there's a lot of gothic rock and death rock out there. This album is sort of the baby's first goth rock album, so use this as your gateway to looking into more goth and death rock albums.
What's that moving in the basement? What's that moving in the attic? Who's that walking in the shadows? Who's that walking in the streets?
The next albums I have for you today come in pairs. I have 2 albums by Burzum with titles I cannot pronounce, so I'm going to leave that to Google Translate.
Baldrs, Hliðskjálf.
Burzum is a legendary black metal project founded by the infamous Varg Vikernes. He released a slew of atmospheric, rough-sounding black metal albums in the early 90s, and they've since gone down to be beloved by metalheads alike. But these 2 albums saw a complete 180 in his sound. Instead of making black metal, he moved on to making dark ambient. And this is due to the fact that he recorded these albums while serving time in prison, where he only had limited access to a synthesizer and a tape recorder. And just as a side note, I'm not going to go into the details of why he was arrested, because it is a long, gruesome story. I'll leave all that for you to look up if you're interested. Despite the fact that he wasn't making black metal on these albums, they're still incredibly dark, incredibly atmospheric, and medieval sounding at times. And there's definitely some light-hearted sounding songs on each album, but overall they're both very, very dramatic sounding and can be pretty disturbing. And both albums definitely did not get great reception when they came out, probably because they weren't black metal, but I think they've aged quite well, and I believe they've also inspired many, many other dark ambient and dungeon synth sounding albums. So if you are just getting into Burzum and you get to these albums, definitely don't skip them. They're not black metal, and that's okay. They sound just as good, and they are very entertaining to listen to. Next albums I have for you today, I have 2 more that come in pairs. I have 2 albums by the band The Absence. While Cradle of Filth may have been one of the early bands that got me into extreme metal, this band is responsible for getting me into death metal. The Absence is a fairly obscure band coming from Tampa, Florida, and I discovered them through watching an old YouTube series called Ask Swifty. The user who made this series, known as SWIFTKARATECHOP, used the song A Breath Beneath as the opening track for pretty much all of his videos. And I looked into the album that had it and discovered this. This is their first album. When I first heard this album, I was actually kind of surprised by how much I liked it. And I was also surprised by how melodic it sounded. My perception of metal at the time was just being heavy and being loud. There was no melody involved in it, and this kind of blew me away. It's also a much rougher sounding record. You can tell that whatever they used to record it was probably not the most state-of-the-art technology. But nonetheless, I really enjoyed it, and after listening to it, I went on to listen to this album, which is their second one. It's pretty much more of the same melodic death metal music, but the recording quality sounds much, much better. Sonically, it just sounds bigger, and I don't know if it's because they got a better producer or if they got better equipment for recording. Who knows? But also, both albums' covers are pretty freaky looking. This one especially is pretty disturbing to look at. Yeah, they're great records, definitely worth checking out. And shout out to SWIFTKARATECHOP for getting me into them. Thanks, pal. last two albums I have for you today also come in pairs. I have two albums by the group Dark Ages. These two albums are fairly recent finds, and they are some of the spookiest sounding music I've heard in a very long time. The band is a duo that composes dark ambient songs inspired by European medieval history, hence their name Dark Ages. The Twilight of Europe was the first album they'd put out, and A Chronicle of the Plague was the second one. And I'm not gonna lie, the main reason I have these albums is because of Chronicle of a Plague. I might be sadistic for saying this, but I liked the idea of getting a record that centered around the Black Plague while we are in the midst of a pandemic. There was something kind of fitting about that. But Twilight of Europe is just as good. It makes some references to the Black Plague, but it's less conceptual and more of just a collection of kind of general stuff that happened in the Dark Ages. And if anything, these albums are perfect to put on if you were to do a fake haunted house and you needed some kind of creepy ambience. Although I doubt many people are going to be doing that nowadays, thanks coronavirus. But if you want some truly creepy sounding dark ambient music, this stuff right here, this is great. And also, just look at the album art for each of these. It's all just so disturbing and so horrifying. I could stare at it for ages. You all should absolutely listen to these albums for Halloween. They are so, so good. Alrighty then, Internet, that does it for me. Hey, if you have any spooky, scary sounding albums you like to listen to during Halloween, leave a comment down below, and if I like it, maybe I'll feature it in another Halloween vlog. Also, if you like this video, be sure to hit that subscribe button. It'll show me the support and I'll love your face for it. And also, follow me on Instagram for even more music. I post a new album on there semi-frequently, talk a little bit about it, and it gives you a bit of an insight of what else is in my collection. So, thank you all very, very much for watching. Happy Halloween, and this is Ghost Olin from What I'm Listening To, signing out. Goodbye! Alright, let's see if I got him.